I'm Shar Banerjee, and this is Books That Built Me. I'm an ex-executive turned to leadership coach specializing in people managers. My job is to get people out of that manager headspace and into their leadership growth space. Typically, I work with clients to build their leadership DNA and self-leadership muscles in group programs or one-to-one coaching. But on this show, we dive deep into the stories of other leaders. And it all starts with a book that they believe has fueled their passion, influenced their decisions, and now these book lessons are life lessons. Welcome to Books That Built Me. Today, I'm in conversation with Lance Lamoureux, and in today's episode, we will discuss the First Rule of Mastery by Michael Gervais. And so this book is all about the word FOPO, which is our fear of people's opinion. Michael Gervais is a high-performance psychologist, and he presents a groundbreaking guide for overcoming what may be the single greatest constrictor of human potential, which he terms FOPO, our fear of other people's opinions. And note that this is actually not the actual negative opinion that's so problematic, it's the fear of that opinion. He says, and I quote, "FOPO shows up in almost everywhere in our lives, and we let FOPO take control. When we let it take control, we play it safe and small because we're afraid of what will happen on the other side of critique. When challenged, we surrender our viewpoint. We trade in authenticity for approval. We please rather than provoke. We chase the dreams of others rather than our own. But it does not have to be this way." And so in this conversation with Lance, we're going to explore how and really get into it. I am so glad you could join us. Here we go. Awesome. Welcome, Lance. So everybody, Lance is an assistant professor for leadership and management at a corporate university, and he is joining us here live in studio to talk about the first rule of mastery. Stop worrying about what people think of you. Welcome, Lance.
Thank you, Shar. It's so awesome to be here.
Yeah, when I first talked to you about this podcast and potentially talking about books, like I can see your background, you can see my background, book nerds
Yep.
unite.
That's right. That's right.
We love reading, we love learning, we love sort of thinking and marinating on some of the lessons that books have to offer. What is it about this book that you thought, Shar, this is the one? I recently read it. You even sent me your notes ahead of time because
Yes.
there's so much good stuff here. What is
Yes.
it about this book at a very high level that you feel needs to be in the hands of more people?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shar. That's such a great question. Wow. Yeah. For obviously, I love this thing. I mean, you can see how it's had. I've got
Yeah.
all these markers and yeah,
I
really
gotta say,
detailed
it's so
notes.
colorful too. Like for people who are just listening to this, the man's got, what is it? Call it 50 little tabs and all color coded.
Right. Right.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. I think so. My job is to help leaders, to help build the capacity of leaders, and kind of what's underneath the surface, that's where I really have to dedicate so much of my work. And you'd be so surprised how few leaders have really thought about their purpose, have really
Mm.
kind of gone deep. And it's just so essential to building their capacity and aligning their emotions and all of those other things. And so there's a difference between those leaders who do have that firm foundation of purpose and those who don't. And how they show up is completely different. And furthermore, their well-being, just their
Yeah.
ability to be happy and to adapt to challenges is completely different.
That's awesome. So when you look at the title of this book, it talks about mastery.
Hmm.
And I can see how that would like people who are performance based will want to gravitate to this book. So kudos to the title, like good job on titling this book
Right.
so that the right people actually reach out for it. And the way that they talk about it is it's all obviously it's about, and we'll talk about it. It's called FOPO,
Hmm.
fear of
Right.
other people's opinions. And the entire idea is that in order to master anything, you've got to
Hmm.
stop worrying about other people's opinions. But I
Hmm.
love how you translate that to actually what that looks like is being crystal clear on
Hmm.
what it is that you care about, or what is it that drives you, and what is your true purpose in life.
Hmm. Yep. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So before we get into that, let's actually stick to the mechanics of, what is it? I think at a very high level, most humans can understand this,
Uh-huh.
right? Like this feeling of I care about what you think.
Right.
It's like inherent to my way of being. I've learned how to dress myself because I care what you think.
Right.
I've got my degree in whatever I've got my degree in because I care what other people think. Yeah, maybe we can just spend some time here. Like, what actually is FOPO? Where does it
Yeah.
come from? Like, why is it so prevalent, you think?
Yeah, well, it's fundamental to how our brain is wired. So our brain is wired to survive. And how we've been able to survive through so many years is because we're able to work together in groups.
Yeah,
6 million years ago, like Michael Gervais said in his book, 6 million years ago on the African savannah, we would not have survived alone.
yeah.
Furthermore, if you get kicked out of the group, that meant certain survival. And so our brain, the brain that we're operating in today is the same brain that we had before. And so when we sense that we aren't getting approval from someone else, or someone has that really negative piece of feedback for us that we internalize, and it's really hard, what that does is it triggers the amygdala. It triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response where the alarm bells, and we shift our thinking from the prefrontal cortex, the executive portion of our brain, and then we go into survival mode. And so that's why we're just so orientated, and that's why we're so keyed in on what are they thinking about
Right.
me. And we think about that more than others actually truly think about us, the science has found. And so it's kind of this survival mechanism. And so it's one of those both and, like, we do need to care about what people think, but we can't let it get in the way of doing great work. So it's got to,
Awesome.
be able to balance both of those.
Awesome. And I say this often. It's like you can't exist in the binary form. You can't say, I don't want any of it and I'll reject all of it.
Right.
And you can't say, I care about it, to the point that it defines me completely. Like
Hmm.
the answer is always in the middle. It's always a question of balance. And so in this book, they talk about the acronym FOPO,
Uh-huh.
which is a play on FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yep.
Um, though it's interesting, right? The parallels between the two, where FOPO is the fear of other people's opinions,
Uh-huh.
and FOMO is the fear of missing out. It's like it's always about belonging in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
Um, but this book dives into FOPO, which is the fear of other people's opinions. It's not the fear of them delivering the opinion, but it's actually
Hmm.
the fear
Hmm.
that their opinion is coming or
Right.
percolating, or it's like, yeah, it's the germification of the actual opinion. It's not the
Hmm.
opinion itself. Yeah,
Right.
so diving into that a little bit further, I think
Uh,
one of the things in this book, um he calls out a lot of quotes. He calls out a lot of quotes about how so many other philosophers in life talk about, when you care about what other people think, you will always be their prisoner.
hmm. Hmm.
There's this beautiful diagram in the book that
Hmm.
circles the things that are in your control versus the things that are not in your
Right.
control. And I think that's just such a beautiful reminder of, like, you literally have nothing that you can control apart from your thoughts, your words, your actions, your attitudes, right? Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
true extreme ownership of what belongs to you is what you're in control of. And
Hmm.
then there's like everything else outside, including your dog, the weather, cars, money,
Hmm.
how other people feel, what other people think. Such a simple diagram, but really just illustrates at the heart of it, you can only do this much, but if you do this much really, really well, that can super enrich your life.
Right, right. Yeah, it's so important to not get distracted. Because that's what we think about all the time, is we're thinking about other people's opinions when,
Yeah,
like you said, they haven't even said anything yet, but we're kind of guessing. And so to get better alignment and to really pay attention to what really matters, and focusing on, like you said, those matters that are in our control. And again, like, I want to keep going. You'll hear me keep going back to capacity.
yeah,
That's one of those tools that we can use to increase our capacity, is that we are just focused on what we control. We are focused on our circle of influence, because there is so much noise out there. There's a lot going on. And so, develop that internal experience, and then live it externally. That's something that Michael Gervais talks about all the time. He does
mm,
he does work with the most elite athletes. And he said that that's the number one thing that gets in the way of peak performance, is when an athlete is thinking externally of like,
Mhm.
what are people going to think of this performance, or how are they
Mhm.
going to rate me? And so instead, in his work, he's got to really turn people inward and get really clear on that. Let's focus on what is in your control, and the other opinions, those things on the outside, just let it be, focus inward, so that way you can be your best outward. And I just think that's such a great example for us all.
Let's talk about identity, because the story that you just talked about with, athletes who are
Mhm,
at the peak of their game, maybe a really high stressful 10-second moment.
mhm,
For example, there was one anecdote in the book about a basketball player who needed a point. And sorry, I'm not a sports person, so I don't
yeah, you're
remember all
good.
the names, but it was a very high stress point, and this person was known as the mailman
Uh-huh.
because he always delivers, like he
Hmm.
always delivers the mail.
Hmm. Right.
And so before he goes to shoot his three shots that he has,
Hmm.
someone pops over to him and says, um, the mailman takes a break on Sunday, or something to that effect, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
insinuating that there's no mail today and it's
Yeah.
Sunday, and nothing's going to happen. And so yeah, I mean, the worst happens. He completely misses shot 1, misses shot 2, misses shot 3, and it all goes back to this thing about identity.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so in the book, there's this entire section that talks about, well, if you believe that your identity is X,
Hmm.
and somebody's opinion of you violates that core, well, you're not X. Like today's
Hmm.
not the day for X. That is, he talks about like being on the highway.
Uh-huh.
Like
Uh-huh.
you're on the highway for having other people dictate how you think about yourself, which then violates the sense of self that you have of yourself, that like that strong control of who you believe you are.
Hmm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, isn't it fascinating? Oh yeah, Karl Malone is the name of the
Thank you.
basketball player
Oh
for
my
the
God,
Utah
thank
Jazz.
you.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a great example. It's a
Yeah,
great example, and he was just able to do this little. That player. I can't remember the name of the player who said that. I mean, the player did it on purpose to
he did it on
get in
purpose.
Karl Malone's head, and yeah, and that happens in the workplace. That happens in the workplace all the time. I've never observed a leader lead without being criticized. Like every leader, if you step into the arena, which that's what leaders do, is they are vulnerable, they go first, they step into the arena. Like that wonderful speech by Teddy Roosevelt. They step into the arena, and the thing is, when you step in the arena, you will be criticized. I mean, like, look at Taylor Swift. Like, she is at the absolute top of her game. I mean, she is just this incredible musician. She's giving her truck drivers these incredible bonuses, life-changing money. She was a country singer, and when she went to R&B, people are like, "Oh, what are you doing? You're not that. You're a country singer." And imagine if she had listened to the noise.
Yeah.
Imagine if she had listened to the critics. Instead, she's living that internal purpose, those internal values, and she's going to just move forward and do what she feels is right. And 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 it's a very empowering way to live,
Yeah.
and the results speak for themselves.
The Taylor Swift thing is so fascinating. I was watching a documentary about this, and I think coming back to purpose, right, to make it
Hmm.
more practical for Taylor Swift, this whole thing of who are you to sing
Hmm.
R&B? Like you belong in the country music domain.
Uh-huh.
You know, I the thing that she says often is that she is born to tell stories.
Hmm.
And that's actually what she does really, really, really well. Like she is telling stories through her music. And it doesn't matter that someone thinks that it's got to be this genre or the other genre. For her, her purpose is, did I tell a story in a way that needed to be told? And
Wow.
if the answer is yes, like she proceeds forward.
Wow, unbelievable. So this is the first I've heard this. This is
Yeah.
amazing. So maybe that's the reason why she's shifted so many times in her
Yeah.
career, because this is going to enable her to tell that story better.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I wonder too if even those salary bonuses or raises given to her team is part of the story that she wants to tell. Like,
Yeah.
yes, it's not music form, but maybe there's a bigger story, there's a bigger arc to the
Hmm.
why she's doing what she's doing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just love her, right? Like it's so interesting because the thing that you said about stepping into the arena, she does things so differently from other artists. Um she does things that most artists like don't consider doing, but she'll do it because it's authentic to her.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think the really fascinating thing as it relates to this book, right? As it
Hmm.
relates to other people's opinions and, hesitating before you do a certain thing, what is it about her, you think? And maybe we don't have to talk about Taylor Swift, and just like leaders at large
Hmm.
that are the ones that capture our attention and
Yeah.
capture our, um, just our attention span a little bit more because of the audacity with which they exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, working with leaders, the number one element that I've personally seen, just based on my anecdotal experience, that really distinguishes those leaders that make a positive impact, that really change things and make things better, and make a positive mark, not just for their own sake, but for the greater good. It comes down to intentionality.
Mm,
Like, that intentionality is key. And Taylor Swift seems to just do that with her concerts, with her albums, with her lyrics, like how she treats other people. There's so much intentionality with that that you can't help but want to pay attention, because
right.
that's leadership. And so, you know, bringing that to the external world, like with a family, a parent who's really intentional with their relationships with their family, with their spouse, with their children, to leaders who are really intentional about how they show up. If I can just share a
Yeah.
quick example. Uh, so I've been recently trying to be very intentional in my relationship with my son. So my son and I, we've always gotten along like really, really good.
How old
And
is he?
he just had a birthday, so I had to think about it. He's 11, just turned
Yeah.
11,
Okay.
like
Okay.
2 weeks ago. And so he and I have always gotten along great. And I love to connect with him. And so one of the ways that I've tried to connect with him is kind of teasing him a little bit. And so
Mm.
he really loves sci-fi. He really loves this show, Dragon Ball Z. So growing up, I never watched stuff like that. I never watched sci-fi. I never watched Dragon Ball Z. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to be really intentional and be curious and try to figure out, why does he enjoy this so much?
Mm.
And so I asked him, I was like, hey, James, can we watch that sometime together? And his eyes got like this big when I told him I wanted to watch the show with him, because usually he'll pause it. Like when I walk by, because I've teased him about it a couple of times where they're like, there's kind of a ridiculous part. And, I'm just trying to connect with him. And it's not like, bad intention, but, I now have learned it bothers him, And so anyway, so I've just done that. It's just a small change, being curious about, why does he like this show so much, and then experiencing it with him. So this started about 2 weeks ago. Just in 2 short weeks, our relationship's totally different. So I usually
Wow.
start work pretty early in the morning, downstairs in the basement when I'm not in the office. And he's never come downstairs to give me like a hug and say goodbye when he leaves. Usually, like, when I give him his breakfast, like we say goodbye then. But now he comes downstairs to say goodbye. And now when he gets home from work, I'm sorry, when he gets home from school, the first thing he does is come to my office and give me a hug and say hello. Where he never did that before. Before, it's like when I came out, he'd be like, hey, Dad. And then maybe he'd give me a hug. So just this one little intention of watching this show that I'm not personally interested in, but through that curiosity, I'm now interested in it, and we've connected more. And so it's just a little example of how intentionality can just go such a long ways in leadership and building those relationships, because that's what leaders do, right? Leaders connect. They bring people together to unite them.
My heart is racing. That is such a beautiful story. Like the amount of love that your son now probably feels from you is causing him to do the things that he never did before, like visiting
Right.
you in your office morning and after school. And I think one of the things you said that was so beautiful is like there's a difference between fitting in and belonging.
Hmm.
And I think what intentionality, curiosity, openness creates is pockets of belonging
Hmm.
for other people to feel welcome, right? Like it's easy to fit in. I can wear the clothes that you think are cool. I can say the words that make me sound whatever. But to truly belong is to be welcome in spaces in your whole self, including watching Dragon Ball Z.
Right.
Dragon Ball Z, right?
Yep.
Like imagine an 11-year-old feeling so comfortable in his skin, where he now feels like his skin is this. This is kind of nerdy, but he feels like his skin is like this dashed line that extends beyond him, and that he can include another in that space. Um, just fascinating,
Mhm.
absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that gorgeous story.
Yeah, yeah, you're welcome. And I've also found that there's a second component. So
Mhm.
it begins with intentionality, and then the second part is that alignment. So we begin with that intention, which is to connect, and then we align our behavior in a way that makes that connection. So before I was trying to connect by teasing him. Well, that
Right.
didn't work. And so, you got to try something different. You got to make sure that we align the two. I actually only wrote down one quote from the book. I want to make sure I
Do
shared.
it. Do it.
Uh,
I love that it's on a
yeah,
post-it.
it's on a
You're
little
like,
post-it
don't
note.
forget this.
Yeah, he said, "Purpose rather than approval becomes the filter through which we make decisions and choices."
Oh,
So,
say that again.
purpose rather than approval becomes the filter through which we make decisions and
Mm,
choices.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, that inclusion, like you were just talking about, because that's what we're all after is to be approved of. And so by me watching this show with my son, he feels like I'm approving of him more, that I don't think that show is silly or a waste of time.
Yeah.
He's feeling more included in our relationship. And so I just love that idea that this becomes, the lens through which we see the world
Yeah.
is focused on that purpose rather than approval from others.
Yeah. I kind of want to spend some time here because I think there's this part in the book that talks about um, being a performance obsessed culture or being
Hmm.
part of a performance obsessed culture, which is an undeniable reality. There's this part in the book where he talks about how we base our self worth on performance results and we're a performance infused culture. And so they talk about a performance based identity is defined by how well we do something relative to others, right? Like
Hmm.
there's that comparison piece to this whole thing. And so he talks about how a performance based identity is actually defined by three distinct factors. One being a contingent self worth, which I love that he coined that term, like contingent self worth. We can dive into that a bit more. So, one's a contingent self worth. Another one's a looming fear of failure. God, how many people can like relate to this one? And the third one is perfectionism,
Hmm.
right? And so, um, the whole concept here is that because we are constantly tying our self-worth to performance results, we end up avoiding situations where we might fail or we lose the freedom to test ourselves and see what we're made of, right?
Hmm.
And so the core motivation of pursuing excellence, if the core motivation of pursuing excellence is proving our self-worth, then mistakes and opinions and criticism, it feels like a threat rather than a learning opportunity. And I feel like we need to spend some time here because this is such a reality
Yeah.
of corporate North America. I'll say North America because I'm Canadian and I know you're in the States. So I want to be included in corporate North America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, people are unable to disassociate who they are with their performance. And that's a serious serious problem because that's how we learn is we make mistakes. Like nobody has learned how to walk without stumbling, without falling. No one learns how to lead without making mistakes along the way. No one learns how to be a good parent or a good partner without making mistakes. And so, this is kind of that idea of the growth mindset, that this belief that I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
get just a little bit better every single day. And this is a way that we can kind of reframe things, because this is something I've seen so often in my career, where you have someone that is a high performer, they're at the top of their game, and then they retire. They retire and their life kind of falls apart because they had this identity. They were able to associate who they were with this identity, and then they retire, and then, oh my gosh, nobody's calling me sir or ma'am anymore, and I've lost my value, I've lost my self-worth. And that's why it's so important that we do go inward, because we don't know when we're going to lose our
Mm-hmm.
role or our position. Our children eventually are going to go off and go to college, and if our identity is just as a parent and they go on and live their own lives, then what? We've got to have that. Again, going back to what Michael Gervais says all the time, we have to be inner directed and then live it outwardly.
Mm-hmm.
So, have that internal self worth and then live that externally, rather than the other way around, which is we listen to the noise of what we should become. Oh, well, my dad wants me to be, a successful executive. So therefore, I have to do it. So I apply for a job to become an executive. I don't get it. And now my self worth is gone. Whereas someone who lives internally, that growth mindset, they're like, well, my purpose is to be helpful and to lead well. And here's an executive management job I'd love to apply for. Oh, I didn't get it. Well, I learned some lessons. I'll be more prepared the next time. And now I'm gonna, this is gonna fuel my fire. I'm gonna do even more, to be ready for the next one that comes. So this kind of shows how two different people can experience the exact same thing. One person doesn't get the job, and it's a crisis. It's an internal crisis where now they're questioning their self-worth. Whereas someone else is like, ooh, this stings a little bit. I wish I'd gotten it, but I'm going to be okay. Like, it is
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna be okay, and it is okay. Let's get into the tactical stuff. Like,
Yeah.
how do you do that? Because he does spend some time talking about one or two really cool key practical applications that get you closer to removing your self-worth and the identification of you from the opinion of the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which one was your game-changing one? Let's start there. Like, which
Yeah.
one was practical for you?
Yeah. So for me is kind of finding meaning. He talks
Yes.
about finding meaning, and I think he even mentions Viktor Frankl, if I'm not mistaken.
I love that book.
Oh, it's so good.
So good.
So good. Yeah, that's the number one thing I share developing leaders. His
Yes.
quote was, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In
Yeah.
that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Because
Yes.
that is emotional intelligence. Another quote I have on my desk from Viktor Frankl: life, and this is so relevant to what we're talking about today.
Do it.
Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by a lack of purpose and meaning. So, yeah.
I have to say something. For
Yes.
me, the one takeaway from that whole book, I love everything that you're saying, but the
Hmm.
resonant piece for me was that you can find purpose in something that you're doing. You can
Hmm.
find purpose in the way that you're thinking, but you can also find purpose in your attitude, right? Like your attitude is also a choice. It's that invisible something that you can't touch or feel, but empowers and enables you to find good, even in the most dire situation. So for me, I want to like underscore, highlight, capitalize attitude being your superpower.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is so empowering. That is so empowering. And it's so, again, going back to enlarging
Yeah.
capacity,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like, like what really, I mean, emotional intelligence is everything. Like if we can learn to manage our emotions, because emotions are such powerful drivers. And so when we're able to be very intentional about our attitude and our purpose, so emotions are basically predictions. Our body biologically, it's making these predictions. And
Oh,
so
I like that. That's a good way of saying that.
yeah,
Emotions are basically predictions.
yeah, and that comes from a neuroscientist. That comes from Lisa Feldman Barrett. So I didn't come up with that on my own. And so that's what happens. Like
Yeah.
like say you're waiting for a job. Like you applied for a job, and every time your phone rings, your heart races. You have this emotional experience. Like, oh my gosh, is that them calling to offer me the job? Well, you get the job, and then a month later, your phone rings. You don't have that emotional reaction. It's because it's a prediction,
Right.
right? And so by choosing our attitude, by choosing the lens through which we see the world, we then can influence our emotional response to things. So here's an example. So I was invited to speak at an event. It was kind of like a almost like a conference, but not really. But anyway, one of the people there is one of my mentors, just someone I've really loved, respect, and admire. He'd never seen me speak, even though we'd been gotten together several times.
Okay.
So anyway, later after the conference, he stopped by, and I was just like, "Hey, great to see you. Do you have any advice or
Hmm.
any feedback or anything?" And so what happened was he actually turned away and kind of had like a little bit of a smirk, and like my heart sank. The story in my head was like, "Oh, Lance, it was terrible. It was probably awful. People probably didn't get any value out of it, right?" But then I reframed it. I was like, "No, Lance, whatever he has to say is a gift. Like his feedback is a gift." So this is only a second. He only turned away from me for 1 second, and then he turned back and he gave me his insight. He gave me one little piece of advice. He's like, "It was really good, just one piece of advice." And before he had turned back, my emotional state had completely changed,
Mm.
because I was able to, go back to purpose. Like, hey, whatever he has to say is going to make me better. So
Wow.
therefore it's a gift, especially coming from someone like him who's just so good, and so, for someone's opinion that you value so much. And so that's
Wow.
why going back to purpose all the time is so important. So like, we're about to give a presentation. Everybody gets nervous before they speak publicly. Like that's the biggest fear that people have. And so if people can go back to their purpose, like, okay, I'm feeling these butterflies inside, but what's my purpose here? Well, my purpose is to convey the wonderful achievements that my team has accomplished over the past quarter. And so when we're able to connect with that purpose, then that changes our emotional state, thereby enhancing our capacity. And then next thing you know, like, we're smiling and we're excited to be there. And so anyway, this is a very long way of getting back to your original question. My number one thing that I took away is just that connection with meaning, and how we can find meaning, and then that changes our emotional state.
So much to say about this. I want to just have a parallel moment in the book where he has this conversation with his mentor. He's helping out another athlete, and it's a videotaped event, and he is seated as sort of like behind the performance, and so
Mm-hmm,
anyone who is videotaping can see the coach um, in full view. And so on his way home, he's feeling really good because all the internal work that he did with his athlete was so good, and like everything that they worked towards was spot on, like such a great job.
mm-hmm,
And then he gets his phone call from his mentor. And again, this is sort of like back in the day, he dates himself and he says, there's this view of psychologists that you've got to be invisible, that it's like nobody wants to know that a psychologist was involved in performance coaching or
mm-hmm,
training. And so his mentor called to say, like, what are you doing? You're not supposed to sit there, you're not supposed to be seen, like that's not how it goes, essentially. And so it's great because I love how you, in your reframe, you said, Whatever he has to say is a gift and is a way for me to learn. The opposite exists in this book, where he calls his wife to tell her what had happened, and she gave him two words, which was fuck him.
Right.
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 And so this is another strategy that he talks about
Right.
at the end of the book, which is, what if you had a filter? And what if that filter went through your, quote unquote, board of directors? He doesn't call it that, but it's a version of that, which is like, these are the people who are so in your corner and are your true like life gurus, and you select them carefully, you place them there, and they become your filter. And so no matter what is being said to you, it gets passed through this filter, and only the good stuff gets picked up. And so in his story, a decade goes by where he actually stays hidden, stays small, goes muted in so many ways. And a decade later, he was also at a speaking event, and his mentor was there listening to him, and he didn't approach him because I don't he again told himself a story like, oh, I have to go approach him.
Hmm.
And in that exchange, they don't talk about that event from a decade ago, but there's almost this, he realizes, oh my God, I put this person at the center of my universe for so long. And maybe he didn't even realize what his opinion meant to me, or he didn't, like the consequences of that moment was far greater in my life than in his. And
Yeah.
I think he saw it in that exchange. But I wanted to underscore this story because
Hmm.
it highlights a different way of coping. One way of coping is, hey, what's the meaning for this? Like, what's the purpose of me in this moment? And the other way to cope is like, do I actually care about this person's opinion? And if I do, that's great. What's the nugget of wisdom that I can take away? And what's the rest, the fluff, the rest of it that I can, ignore? And it's not mine to hold on to.
Yeah, yeah. It really comes back to those drivers, you know.
Yeah.
So like in that story, it's such a great story. Like his driver was his approval from his mentor. Like
Yeah.
that really drove him.
Yeah.
And so when he got that phone call, like you said, he was devastated. Like I mean, he was heartbroken. And it even, even though his wife gave him that advice, like it still stung for
Right.
years. Like
Yeah.
years that still was hard. And so we've got to keep going back to those drivers. Like, what are our drivers? And other people's opinion, not sustainable. Our role, not sustainable. Our position, not sustainable. What is sustainable is our purpose. That's one of those things that can transcend any role, any position. It's one of those things that is generative.
The last technique that I have to touch on, because I think it's so impactful and effective, is thinking about your own death. That's
Yeah.
that's what he leaves us with at the end of the book.
Yep.
And it's not morbid. It's not morbid. He proves that actually considering your own death in the journey of you is actually such a empowering way to live, because I think it immediately enables you to snap into perspective. Like, if you are well aware, and this is something that is so common, we all know that death is coming. We all know that that's inevitable. But most humans think it's not going to happen to them in the immediate future. And, thereby really just kind of like discounting the fact that the end will come.
Yeah.
The point here being that when you consider that the end is approaching, or we're all on our way to dying one day, it just snaps into perspective of the decisions and the choices that you make on a day by day basis, right? There's this beautiful thing that Brene Brown says, which is that courage is a series, or authenticity, I should say, is a series of choices that you make every single day. And so much of that ties into considering your life's end at any sort of important juncture in your life, or any sort of critical feeling of like, oh, someone's doing that, or what are they thinking, and what's important about that. That was very, 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 I think it really resonated with me as an awesome technique to get you to snap back into reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's so powerful for emotions.
Yes.
Because we're able to, where we get that piece of criticism. We're putting ourselves out there, we're trying to make a difference, and someone gives us that piece of criticism. When we reflect on the shortness of life, it's like, you know what?
Don't
That
matter.
is not a concern. Something else we can do is just ask ourselves, like, okay, how am I going to feel about this 10 days, 10 months, or 10 years from now?
Yeah.
And that's another way that we can align our emotions, is creating that space. And, that perspective can help, kind of remove some of that sting. So that way, our amygdala can calm down, and we can use more of our thinking brain.
I love that. And I don't know if this was in this book or in another book. This is the problem with reading too many books. I forget where it belongs. But there's this one thing I read in a book about how emotions actually stay with you for 90 seconds. And whatever happens after that is actually not the emotion. It's some story that
Right.
you have assigned value to. And I
Yeah.
think just even like the simplicity of that, can help you sort of pause. And if something has lingered for even 10 minutes, you're like, okay, well, what's the story here? Okay,
Right.
well, let's
Right.
break down that story. And the emotion, to your point, you said the emotion is, um, what was that beautiful thing you said?
Um, I'm not
It's like
quite.
it's like an indicator of
Yeah, yeah. So the emotion's an indicator of values.
that's it. That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And so we can just kind of reframe it. Like for example, where you get that negative, you get that constructive feedback. So we interpret that as hard at first, because our value is to do good work. It's to
Mhm.
like really perform and to be a great team player and all of those things. And so when we get that constructive feedback, we're just like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing as well as I thought. But again, by doing some of these things we're talking about, reframing, connecting with purpose, we're like, no, it's okay. Like, this feedback is going to help me to get better, because 10 days from now, like, I'm not even going to remember this at all. Like, seeing this in the larger scheme of things, being able to see that the forest amidst the trees is
Right.
is so important.
Yeah, and he even says that if you can identify your values up front, that work has plays massively in moments like this when you say, well, what is my real value here? Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. One of my true core values is to always be growing and learning. And so, even though this felt bad, and I can understand why it felt bad, and oh, yeah, this is a reminder that this is an important dimension in my world right now. Okay, and what was my value again? Okay, learning and growing. Okay, how can I ensure that I'm custom tailoring, I'm like fitting this feedback into that lens of how is this learning and growing me? And what if I only focused on that?
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
so cool.
Yeah, and that's not something like what you just described. That's not innate. Like, we don't come thinking like that. That takes a lot of intentionality, like a lot of deliberate effort to think in that way. And how much better off will society be, our children, everyone, if we can kind of teach other people these skills? Because again, that capacity will be enhanced, and we can do more. Like, we can do more good.
Yeah. I read a lot of books and I have a lot of conversations about books. So I try not to say, oh my God, this was my favorite. But I have to tell you, Lance, not 5 minutes before you and I were supposed to talk is when I finished this book. Not 5 minutes.
Wow.
Yes. It's been a busy couple of weeks, and so I only could get to it yesterday. And so I finished this book in a mad rush, but I took notes and I was so fascinated actually by the way he broke down a simple concept like stop worrying about what other people think about you. Because the truth is that as parents or for younger kids, we always tell them that we're like, don't worry about what they think, like that's not
Mhm.
important. And for some reason that lesson gets muted as you become adults, right? Like it's harder to tell yourself, hey, don't worry about what that other person says, or it just becomes this generic thing that you like hand out like candy, like, hey, don't worry about what other people think. What I loved about this book was he broke it down into science. And
Mhm.
there are so many case studies about why it matters, when it happens, how come it happens, how do you break down the process. Like books like this that tickle my scientific brain and then give me practical tidbits, they go in the Golden Hall of Fame. And so I just want to say this book makes it to the Golden Hall of Fame. It
Wow.
is fantastic.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah. Yeah. So happy to hear that. And I don't feel like it's gotten the notoriety
No.
that it
Yeah.
deserves. Because I mean, I'd never heard anyone put that into language, FOBO.
Yeah.
Gervais coined it, like that's, but once you are kind of provided with that mental model, that fear of other people's opinions, FOBO, can absolutely derail our performance and our well-being. Like once you learn that mental model, it's very empowering. Kind of like Viktor Frankl's quote from earlier.
Mm.
Like once you learn that, it's so empowering. Just this simple shift in the way that we think can have these profound results in our life. And that's just really, really a gift.
It really is a gift. Thank you, Lance, for this wonderful conversation. So fulfilling and so much good stuff here. Thank you so much for sharing and opening up about your personal life and how this has impacted you. What a gift. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Shar. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And that's it for this episode of Books That Built Me. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a review. It really helps support what we're doing here. Thanks for listening, and you can always find me on my LinkedIn at Shar Ban. If you're dealing with a leadership challenge, I would love to hear from you and have you join our awesome community. And of course, I will talk to you next Tuesday on a brand new episode of Books That Built Me.